They laid me off the same morning my son called to brag about his new title VP of something or other. Name's Rufus, 62, former maintenance supervisor with a stiff knee and a thermos that still smells like burnt coffee. My old employee badge was still in my pocket when they changed the locks. Ever been told you're obsolete by someone who used to ask you for lunch money? I still remember the sound of his fork hitting the plate. That was the moment my son decided I no longer belonged. It wasn't angry or loud, just the quiet clink of stainless steel on ceramic. But it cracked something inside me more than words ever could. All week, the wooden dining chair I always used had been shifting back just a few inches closer to the wall every night. I thought I was imagining things. I chalked it up to Clayton's modern decorating sense, or Marla vacuuming too enthusiastically. But that night it felt intentional, a signal I hadn't wanted to read. It was a Thursday in late November 2017, the kind of chilly evening where the porch light flickers and leaves clog the gutter. We were at Clayton's house in Springfield, Missouri, my son's house now. Warm light spilled over the table, giving the illusion of comfort. The meatloaf was dry, or maybe my throat was. Marla poured herself wine like it was medicine steady without looking up. Jonas, my grandson, barely touched his plate, poking at green beans like they might bite back. Clayton, my firstborn, the one I taught to ride a bike on Walnut Street, the one I carried out of that fishing pond when he broke his ankle, sat calmly with his napkin folded neatly in his lap, as if he'd rehearsed. "You're too old to live here now, Dad," he said, just like that. No build-up, no apology, like offering me coffee. I looked at him for a long second. The walls felt closer than they had a moment ago. My hands resting near the fork curled slightly, not in anger, but in restraint. My eyes drifted toward the pie cooling on the stove. I'd made it that morning a habit I kept even though the kitchen was no longer mine. I didn't ask questions. I didn't argue. That's what probably surprised him most. I think a part of him had prepared for a fight for me to raise my voice, for some dramatic refusal that would justify whatever plans he'd already set in motion. But all I did was swallow hard and nod. "Okay," I said. Marla's glass clinked softly as she poured a second helping. Still, she didn't look up. Her silence was worse than any scolding. Jonas shifted in his seat. His fork, which had hovered midair, finally landed back on the plate. "Grandpa," he started, but Clayton shot him a glance that froze the boy in place. I stood slowly, my knees cracked, betraying my age. In a way I never had when I ran little league drills or patched the roof. The silence stretched out like rubber thin, but unbreakable. "I'll leave after the weekend," I said. "Give me time to pack." Clayton nodded once. Of course, there was pie on the stove, apple cinnamon heavy on nutmeg, because that's how Jonas liked it. But no one moved to get dessert. No one said anything. I stepped out before they could change their minds or worse, pretend to be kind. The air outside bit sharper than expected. I pulled my cardigan tighter and rubbed my arms. Then I saw it. On the curb, tucked near the trash bin, was my old red toolbox. The one I'd used since 1978. The handle was frayed, the latches rusted, but every dent had a story. I stood frozen, my breath fogging in front of me. Did they mean to throw that out too? It wasn't the toolbox that hurt. It was what it meant. I had become disposable. An extra drawer they no longer needed. A placeholder between generations. I walked to the curb, bent down slowly, and lifted the box. It was heavier than I remembered. Maybe it was the years, or maybe it was just grief. I held it against my chest, not ready to let go. I placed the peach pie on the front steps before sunrise. I didn't ring the bell. The chill in the air made my breath visible, a puff of white that hovered just long enough to make me feel like a ghost in my own life. The flannel shirt I wore still held the faint scent of last night's campfire, an old habit from before things became complicated. My loafers, scuffed at the toe, made soft, tired sounds against the concrete as I stepped back to look at what I'd left behind. The pie sat in its dish like a peace offering no one asked for. I hadn't slept well. Dreams of my mother's handwriting haunted me, the recipe card yellowed at the corners, folded too many times, but still crisp in my memory. 2 cups sliced peaches, 1 teaspoon cinnamon. Don't forget the lemon zest. I hadn't forgotten. Even after all these years, my hands remembered what my mind wished it could forget. I didn't need to knock. I knew they wouldn't open the door, not at this hour. But I lingered anyway, just in case. Just in case Clayton suddenly changed his mind or Marla came to say anything that might explain her silence at the table last night. But the curtains stayed closed except for the faintest twitch in the corner window. I saw it, though I pretended not to. The porch light hadn't turned on. Maybe it was set to a timer. Maybe they switched it off. Either way, it made everything feel colder. I shoved my hands deeper into my coat pockets and took one last look at the pie. The steam rising from it curled like the handwriting on that old recipe card, dissolving into the morning air before I could reach out and touch it. I didn't want to touch it. I just wanted them to see it. To know that in spite of it all, I had made something with my hands and my memory. Something sweet. The borrowed sedan waited across the street, its engine-cold windshield dressed in a constellation of maple leaves. I climbed in slowly, one joint at a time, resisting the movement. The vinyl seat gave a tired creak under me like it too was older than it should have been. As I turned the key, the engine sputtered before settling into a grumble. I didn't look back immediately, but I didn't pull away either. I sat there for what felt like a full song on the radio, except the radio was off, and the only soundtrack was the soft whoosh of my breath and the ticking of the dashboard clock. Then movement, a flicker in the rearview mirror. Marla. She opened the front door slowly, as if expecting someone else to be standing there. Her robe was pulled tightly around her, the same wine-colored one I had bought her last Christmas. She didn't look around. She looked down, at the pie. And then, without touching it, without even a smile or sigh, she closed the door behind her. I exhaled slowly and shifted into drive. No honk, no wave, just the sound of wet tires rolling over fallen leaves. The road to my new place wasn't long, but it felt longer than it should have. The houses on either side grew unfamiliar the farther I went, architecture with sharper lines, newer paint porches without rocking chairs. The kind of neighborhood where people hired others to rake the leaves. I parked outside my one-bedroom rental, a squat little structure with peeling siding and a stubborn screen door. The porch light here flickered like it couldn't make up its mind whether to shine or quit. Inside it was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that soothes, but the kind that makes you suddenly aware of your own breathing. I turned on the stove not to cook, but to have something warm near me. The burner clicked, then glowed orange. I unwrapped the extra slice I had saved not for them, but for me, and placed it on a chipped plate. It looked small now, orphaned and sad. I set it gently on the stove's edge where the warmth could reach it. Then I pulled up a stool and sat down beside it, arms folded, watching the steam rise. I wasn't hungry, not for pie, not for forgiveness, just stillness. Outside, a squirrel scampered across the porch railing, pausing briefly to sniff the air before darting out of sight. I heard no cars, no footsteps, just the occasional creak of this new house settling like an old man trying to get comfortable. The pie sat there slowly cooling, and I did too. The library cafe smelled of burnt toast and pine sol. That sharp, oddly comforting combination always made me think of my high school guidance counselor's office stern advice, served with weak coffee and linoleum floors that never quite dried. I hadn't planned to stay long, but the cold outside made me linger. I took a seat near the back, same cracked vinyl booth I'd favored years ago when Marla and I were still new to town. I wrapped my hands around the chipped mug of coffee June had slid in front of me without a word. It was barely 7 in the morning, and my presence didn't need explanation. Everyone who came here came to remember or to forget. A flyer was tacked to the wall near the pastry case. Remember the books that made you feel less alone? The font was crooked, probably done on a home printer, and the edges curled like they were trying to fold in on themselves. That's when I saw her, Lorraine Atherton. She hadn't aged the way most people did. Her hair had gone silver, sure, but her smile was intact, uncracked by bitterness or time. She wore a plaid scarf tied loosely around her neck and walked like someone who still enjoyed being noticed. Rufus, she asked, one eyebrow lifting, like it had always done back when we worked at the library together. Lorraine, I replied, not sure if I was more surprised or relieved. She took the seat across from me before I could offer it. June appeared moments later and placed a second mug down, followed by a nod that said, "You're still welcome here. No judgment, no sides. We didn't talk about my son. We didn't talk about the move." Lorraine just leaned forward and said, "There's a book club Thursday evening, same room where the card catalogs used to be. You should come. We're reading Wendell Berry." I almost laughed. "The man who thinks silence is a civic virtue." She grinned. "Quiet people carry heavy things." That sat with me. We lingered until the place began to fill with retirees and toddlers. On my way out, I passed the flyer again and reached out to straighten it. My thumb brushed the tape, and I felt a static cling like some old part of me had just shifted back into place. Instead of heading back to my apartment, I drove out to the storage unit. It was barely 8, but the guy who ran the place was already at his desk watching fishing videos on his phone. I nodded at him and went through the gate. Unit 37 smelled of cedar and something faintly sour, maybe old leather, maybe time. I flipped the switch, and the lone bulb sputtered to life. Boxes stacked too neatly, my life labeled in Sharpie. I knew which one I wanted. A gray folder labeled mortgage deed. I sat cross-legged on the cold floor and opened it slowly like unsealing a wound. There it was, the original house deed. My name. Only my name. No joint anything. I kept flipping through the folder, though I already knew what I'd find. There were property tax receipts, utility stubs, a couple of handwritten reminders, and then the gas bill, the most recent one, still addressed to me, still paid by my auto draft, still invisible. I ran my finger down the crease, pressed the paper flat against my thigh. It wasn't about the money, it never was. It was the quiet assumption that I'd keep paying, keep disappearing, keep being the backstage hand to someone else's play. By the time I got home, the sun had just cleared the rooftops. I set the folder on the kitchen table, sat in the chair that wobbled if you leaned too far left, and opened my laptop. The email started easily. "Dear Mr. Sutherland, I'm seeking clarification regarding ownership status." I typed slowly. Then I stopped. Lorraine's words came back. "Quiet people carry heavy things." I saved the draft but didn't send it. Not yet. I closed the lid, leaned back in my chair, and let the morning seep in. The law office smelled exactly as it had in 2001. Varnished wood, aged paper, a faint trace of coffee from a pot that had probably been left on since dawn. My shoes made a soft tap on the scuffed hardwood as I entered. Nell looked up from behind the reception desk, her nails the same dull yellow as I remembered, one eye squinting beneath the harsh desk lamp. "You're back," she said. Not a question, not even surprise. I nodded and removed my cap. The place hadn't changed. Even the blinds behind her were crooked the same way one slat slightly bent from someone's elbow or briefcase years ago. I stood there for a second longer than I needed to. Harold Dempsey opened his door before she called for him. "Rufus," he said, his voice smooth as a courtroom bench. "Come in." We didn't shake hands. We didn't sit on pleasantries. Harold was a man who respected the economy of silence. I followed him in. His office was lined with shelves, legal books bound in dull navy and deep oxblood red. The same wood paneling framed the room, darkened from decades of tobacco smoke and time. My eyes drifted up to the shelf behind his desk. There among the books and law trophies sat a photo, a picture of my late wife and Harold smiling outside the courthouse, the day we closed on our first home. I had given him that photo in gratitude. It hadn't moved. We got to business quickly. "The house is in your name," Rufus, Harold said, flipping through the manila file. "It's been that way since the original deed. No joint tenancy, no survivorship clause. You're the sole owner." I said nothing, just nodded. "I've drafted a formal vacate notice," he continued, sliding a cream envelope across the table. "Effective at your discretion. You don't have to serve it now or at all. But if you decide to, it's valid." I reached for it slowly, the thick paper warm from his hand. "I also had Nell pull this," he added, handing me a secondary file. "It's from 2018. A request for co-ownership filed but not processed. Signed by Marla only. Never countersigned." I opened it. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, small, deliberate. A note was clipped to the top. "For review, no response." I felt a strange pang, not guilt. Something quieter, like the feeling when a familiar road gets renamed and you're suddenly lost in your own town. Harold didn't speak further. He knew when a man needed air more than advice. I stood nodded and left without fanfare. Outside, the chill had settled in, but it wasn't biting. The kind of weather that made your breath visible just long enough to remind you it existed. I walked past the corner bakery, the one Marla used to visit every Thursday for cherry turnovers. The window display was immaculate rows of pies behind glass, their golden crusts gleaming beneath gentle lamps. Apple, pecan, pumpkin, even peach. My footsteps slowed. I could see my own reflection in the bakery's window, framed by flaky crusts and sugar dust. My face looked off. Not older exactly, just thinner, distant, like someone who had once belonged here but no longer did. I turned away. At home, I placed the vacate notice on my desk. The desk was clean, nothing else on its surface but a pen. I didn't uncap it, didn't sign anything, just set the pen beside the envelope perfectly parallel. No rush, but not forever. I signed my name slowly, not out of hesitation, just to feel the weight of it. Each letter deliberate, almost etched. The ink bled slightly into the paper grain. When I finished, I held the vacate notice in both hands, then folded it once precisely. It fit snugly into the envelope, no air left between its folds. Lorraine's voice floated back from last Thursday's book club. Some letters don't need emotion, just clarity. I walked to the post office in silence. Springfield's air had grown sharper in the last week. Early winter had crept in, stripping the trees bare and leaving their limbs reaching out like old hands. The sidewalk was damp from last night's flurry, but nothing had stuck. Just a few leaves skittering ahead of me, chased by wind. The post office on 3rd and Laurel hadn't changed. Fluorescent lights flickered faintly overhead. A bulletin board to the left held the usual Lost Cat Church fish fry, a battered flyer for flu shots. Chad was behind the counter, sorting a small pile of padded envelopes. He looked up, gave a nod. No smile, no talk. Just the kind of nod you give a man who's mailing something important. I handed over the envelope. He waited, affixed a label. Certified. Tracking included, he said. I nodded. He didn't ask what was inside. I didn't offer. The heater rattled in the corner as I stepped back out. Flakes began to fall again, light dry, like the start of something that wouldn't stay. I pulled my collar up and walked the 6 blocks home, passing the bakery window again. The pies had changed. Cranberry now in the rotation. I didn't pause this time. Back at the apartment, I made tea. Earl Grey bag already used once. Steam curled from the mug before thinning out into nothing. I sat beside the stove and waited. No movement, no sound but the radiator breathing tired air into the room. Then came the ping. Email. I turned slowly, more curious than expectant. USPS tracking your item was delivered at 12:04 p.m. That was it. No emotion. Just clarity. I opened the manila file again, the one Harold had handed me. Marla's handwriting stared back at me from the top of the 2018 co-ownership request. A gentle script, nothing ornate. Requesting consideration for shared deed. Below a signature, just hers. I traced the curve of the M with my eyes. Outside, the light shifted. The clouds thinned briefly, revealing a pale sun. I reached for my phone just as it vibrated. Jonas. A single message. Are you okay? I didn't reply. I stared at the screen, thumb hovering, then retreating. The cursor blinked in the reply box, then vanished when I closed the message. Hours passed. At 4:17 p.m., somewhere across town, Marla opened the mailbox and pulled out the envelope. She didn't speak, didn't scream or tear it up. She read it once, then lowered the paper slowly. Jonas stood a few feet away in the hallway, holding a half-folded towel. He watched her eyes narrowed, not in judgment, but in question. She didn't meet his gaze. She simply walked into the kitchen, left the envelope on the counter, and stared out the window. The keys were placed in a recycled jam jar, the kind Marla used to collect, back when she still enjoyed making preserves in late summer. There was a sticky note folded around the rim, fragile in neat block letters. Jonas's handwriting unmistakable. He'd always written in capital letters, even as a child. Something about how lowercase looked unfinished, he once told me. I picked up the jar carefully. noticing the smear of apricot jam that had seeped into the label. It wasn't fresh, a few days old maybe. The sugar had dried into a brittle glaze. I held the jar in my hands for a long moment before stepping inside. The hallway of my apartment complex smelled faintly of dust and something floral, maybe cheap air freshener. I walked slowly to the small kitchen, set the jar on the counter, and stared at it like it might say something back. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned. Noon sunlight streamed through the blinds, slanting across the carpet in pale lines. I stood there, coat still on loafers, barely brushing the rug, and tried to place what I was feeling. It wasn't relief, not quite closure. Something in between, like finishing a book you didn't love but had to read. The kitchen clock ticked. I opened the jar. Inside, alongside the ring of keys, was a folded note. It wasn't long, just 6 words written on a piece of lined paper torn from a school pad. Didn't know what else to do. I read it once, then again, then once more, each time slower than the last. My throat tightened, but no tears came. I folded the note back along its original creases and slid it into the drawer where I kept coupons and expired batteries. The keys, though, I held them a while longer. Cold metal, familiar weight. The old house key still had the worn red tape around its bow. Frank had wrapped it in 2003 after the basement flooded, so it would be easy to find in a hurry. That basement had flooded 3 more times since. I never replaced the tape. It had faded, cracked at the edges, but it was still there, still mine. I walked to the bedroom, opened the top drawer of my dresser. Beneath a stack of socks, I kept a small black box, the kind cufflinks come in. My father's passed down after his funeral. I hadn't worn them since Marla and I renewed our vows in 1998. Inside was just enough space. I placed the keys in beside the cufflinks and closed the lid. No ceremony, just gentleness. My phone buzzed on the counter. I didn't rush. Let it buzz twice more before I wandered back into the kitchen. Lorraine's name on the screen. I hadn't spoken to her since the book club 2 weeks ago. She'd brought lemon bars that time and quoted Frost in a way that didn't feel performative. I answered. "Hello." Her voice was soft, not the usual cheerful cadence. "Still want to host Thursday?" I paused, glanced around my apartment, the small round table, the worn cushions, the chipped mug, still in the sink. "Yeah," I said. "Yeah, I do." "You sure?" I nodded, knowing she couldn't see it. "I've got the good coffee and a clean floor. That's all anyone really needs, right?" She chuckled. "Sounds perfect." We said our goodbyes. I stood with the phone still in my hand for a moment longer before placing it gently beside the stove. And then I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I pulled out the flour, sugar, butter, peeled a couple of bruised apples from the fridge drawer. I started to make pie. Not for Clayton, not for Marla, not as a gesture of apology or reconciliation. Just enough for 5 people. 5 slices. Maybe 6 if someone asked for seconds. As I rolled the dough, the familiar motion grounded me. My hands remembered the rhythm. Press, turn, press. I could almost hear my mother humming some tune from her garden radio, static-filled and full of warmth. A breeze slipped in through the cracked window. I didn't close it. The scent of cinnamon and vanilla began to rise. I brushed the flour from my hands, wiping them on the apron I hadn't worn since 2010. It still had the stitched initials RM from the Christmas Lorraine insisted we all make handmade gifts. She'd embroidered mine after spilling wine on her first attempt. Claimed the accident made it better. I placed the pie in the oven, checked the temperature twice. Then I sat at the kitchen table, palms flat, eyes, watching the oven's red coil glow steadily. There was no grand turning point, no orchestra rising, just the quiet crackle of pastry beginning to rise, and the faint rustle of maple leaves outside the window. The world didn't shift, but something in me did, and when the timer rang, I stood not with a sigh or a prayer, but with a steadiness that had been missing for years. The pie was golden at the edges, bubbling faintly at the center. I opened the oven door, and the scent poured out like memory. In that moment, I didn't feel old, or discarded, or lost. I just felt present. And that was enough. They brought their own books, and 2 of them brought homemade pickles. One jar was neatly labeled Sweet Heat in pink marker, the other just said Caution in black ink that had smudged slightly with condensation. Neither of the donors explained further, and no one asked. That was the beauty of this group. Small mysteries were left alone like pebbles in the bottom of a river. You let them sit, let them shine or dull in their own time. The smell of nutmeg mingled with the warm dust of old upholstery as folding chairs creaked into place. My living room, if it could be called that, looked like a storage closet moonlighting as a salon. The book stack in the center of the coffee table served as both topic and decoration. Wendell Berry Baldwin, a water-warped paperback of the shipping news. Lorraine had brought that one, saying it felt seasonal. Mr. Kellerman arrived first, his elbows perpetually tucked like he didn't trust the space his arms might take. He carried a metal thermos wrapped in duct tape, said nothing, just nodded once, and sat. Thea and Evie came together laughing before they even knocked Thea's laugh, echoing with the specific wheeze of someone who never quit smoking. She wore a fleece covered in embroidered raccoons and immediately asked where the bathroom was. Her dentures clicked when she laughed, which she did often, especially when someone read aloud in a serious voice. Lorraine arrived last, wearing the same plaid scarf she'd had on when I met her at the library cafe. She carried a zippered folder and a tray of lemon bars. I wasn't sure if they were homemade or store-bought, and I didn't ask. That too felt like part of the unspoken code. The cider simmered in my slow cooker, sending ribbons of cinnamon and clove through the room. I'd found the recipe in an old email chain labeled Thanksgiving 2010. It had been buried between notes about seating charts and an ill-fated attempt at vegan gravy. No one brought up Thanksgiving now. Everyone just sipped and nodded and listened. We took turns reading short passages. Thea chose something by Mary Oliver. Mr. Kellerman read a section from a weather almanac, claiming it was more poetic than people gave it credit for. Lorraine recited a poem she'd written in 1992 about moths in motel rooms and a man who smelled like pipe smoke. When she finished, no one clapped. We just sat in the kind of silence that felt like understanding. Between bites of apple pie, Evie pulled out a dog-eared envelope. This one, she said, tapping the table. This is what I came to talk about. The letter inside was from her sister, written in cursive so tight it looked like lace. We passed it around carefully as if it might tear under the weight of memory. And then, as Lorraine poured another round of cider, she pulled out the folder. The same one she'd had at the cafe, now thick with forms and printouts. The library funds officially open again, she said, smiling at no one in particular. We're raising enough for repairs and a permanent reading room. This, she held up a single form, is just a pledge. You can think about it. She slid the form toward me. The paper was warm from being close to the cider pot. I didn't reach for it. After dessert, I said. She nodded as if that was exactly the answer she'd expected. People stayed longer than I thought they would. Chairs creaked, boots shuffled, one of the jars of pickles was half empty before anyone noticed. Someone had drawn a smiley face on the condensation of the window. No one claimed it, again unimportant. As the evening wound down, Thea pulled out her library card from her purse to show Lorraine a misprint. They spelled my name Theta, like I'm a Greek letter. She laughed so hard her dentures slipped, and Mr. Kellerman offered her a napkin with the kind of gentleness that makes you forget he's been alone since 1996. I didn't say much, just observed. Let the noise drift around me like warm water. It had been a long time since I'd hosted anything. A longer time since it hadn't felt like work. Near the end of the evening, as people were beginning to gather their things and the cider pot had gone quiet, I felt a shift in the room. Subtle, a glance. Lorraine was looking toward the door, and then I saw him. Jonas. He stood just outside behind the glass of the apartment entryway. He was holding a brown paper bag to his chest. It was folded twice at the top, careful. His posture wasn't quite nervous, but not casual either. Like someone who knew the answer might be no but came anyway. I didn't hesitate. Walked over, turned the knob, opened the door. Come in, kiddo, I said. We've got pie. His face changed in a way I hadn't seen since he was 10, caught between embarrassment and gratitude. He stepped in slowly, holding out the bag. Pickles, he said. Mom's recipe. Evie let out a loud whoop. Another contender. He smiled, and for once I didn't search his face for resemblance. I just led him toward the group. The folding chairs made space without needing to be asked. Lorraine slid a slice of pie onto a plate without comment. Mr. Kellerman poured more cider. No one demanded backstory. No one asked why he was late. No one looked for drama. We just made room. Jonas didn't say sorry. He didn't have to. The pie sat on the center of the table, smaller than the last, but still whole. The crust was slightly uneven, puffed too much on one edge. He'd helped roll it out just 10 minutes ago while I peeled the peaches, and Lorraine sliced the butter into the flour. He hadn't spoken much, just hummed something tuneless while measuring brown sugar with too much precision. I didn't correct him. Light snow dusted the windowsill. Outside, the world blurred into soft shapes. Inside, the oven's warmth wrapped around us like a second quilt. The book club had gathered again, folding chairs, scraping gently against the floor cups of mulled cider warming calloused hands. Someone, I think it was Thea, brought cranberry shortbread in a tin with a broken latch. We hadn't planned to read today, not really. The only book on the table was a poetry collection Lorraine slipped out of her canvas bag just before dessert. She'd bookmarked a page with a dried violet petal. When she stood to read, the room quieted like a church on Monday, not holy but still holding echoes of something larger than any of us. Her voice was soft, the kind you lean into rather than hear outright. There are rooms we grow into. She began not by shape or size, but by what we finally choose to keep inside. I caught Jonas looking up from his plate, brow faintly furrowed. He blinked, then refilled my cider without asking. After the poem, no one clapped. No one had to. The silence settled easy. We cleared the plates together. He brought out his own jar of apricot preserves, the good kind, golden and thick from the co-op 2 towns over. I watched him place it next to the sugar tin, his hand hovering for a second too long. I thought, maybe it'd be good for the glaze, he said. It will, I said, and it was. The crust crisped just enough around the edges. The filling bubbled once quietly before settling. We shared that pie with everyone in the room, even Mr. Kellerman, who usually left early because of his back, stayed for seconds. After they left, Jonas lingered. He didn't reach for his coat. Instead, he stood at the counter, fingering the hem of his sleeve. "Can we bake next week?" he asked, not looking at me. I rinsed the pie plate slowly, dried it, set it back on its shelf. "Next week," I nodded, "you make the crust." He smiled wide, this time boyish. I hadn't seen that in years. I opened the small planner Lorraine gave me last Christmas. The cover was fraying, one corner stained with jam from a scone in February. I turned to the blank Sunday page and wrote in ink, not pencil, Jonas. 2 p.m., pie lesson. The oven light flickered off, its job done. I placed the pen down gently, its click the only sound in the room. Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet, constant, familiar. Inside, the apricot spoon glinted in the sink, catching the last light of day. The crust flaked just right this time, not perfect, but patient. Outside, the snow kept on, like it had nowhere else to be, while inside, the scent of warm apricot lingered longer than any apology. Sometimes what breaks isn't the bond itself, just the shape we expected it to hold. You don't always get the words you hoped for, but you might get something sweeter, a quiet presence, a jar of jam, an open Sunday afternoon. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise? I'd love to hear how it showed up, even if it didn't knock.